Thank you, Jason, for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for coming. I want to start by just reminding us of the scripture that we were thinking about for this conference, and it's the scripture in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Then the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend it and keep it. And so my reflections on the stewardship of creation have actually grown out of my experience in living in two very distinct cultures. The mainstream techno-industrial culture of Europe and the United States, where I lived for the first 55 years of my life, and the alternative agrarian-based intentional Christian community where I've lived for the last 20 years. And so living in these radically distinct cultures, I've become very aware of the extent to which the culture in which we live shapes the way we interact with nature and concretely affects our own and particularly our children's ability to take care of and to care for the natural environment and each other. So what I want to do is to begin by considering how just one aspect of our techno-industrial world, the ever-increasing obsession with technology, has resulted in ourselves, and particularly the young in our society, becoming increasingly disconnected from the natural world, a disconnection that has significant environmental, psychological, social, and spiritual implications. And, you know, when we have a conversation at the end, of course, there are many other things in our culture that have this same effect, but I just want to mention this particular one. Well, I know that we are all aware of the increasingly intrusive nature of technology, but just to set the scene, I just want to share a few startling facts if we don't already know them. We live at a time now where more people have access to a mobile device than have access to a toilet and running water, where 3/4 of Americans own smartphones, which means they can be on the internet at almost any time of the night and day from almost any location. And in fact, half the world population is on the internet. The average adult in America spends 5 hours a day watching TV or DVR, and plus 1 or 2 hours a day on social media. They did a research study in 2015 of teenagers and age 13 to 17, and it turned out that they spent 9 hours a day on entertainment media, and that does not include the time that they spent on media for their homework. Jean Twenge at San Diego State has pointed out that this generation of children grew up with cell phones, had an Instagram account, most of them before they went to high school, and they have never known a time before the internet. So they are what she has called a continuously connected generation. Almost all 13 to 17-year-olds, 95% own or have access to a smartphone. 90% go online daily, several times a day, and almost half, 45%, report that they are online constantly. It's the last thing they look at before they go to sleep and the first thing they look at in the morning. Actually, Jean Twenge read a newspaper article about somebody whose telephone caught fire when it was under their pillow, and she couldn't understand why anyone would have their smartphone under their pillow. So she asked her undergraduate students, and it turned out that most of them slept with their phones. So how does this constant interaction with technology affect the way that we interact with nature? Well, it not only causes a major shift, of course, in how we spend our time, but it has also created a different mindset as to what we consider to be relevant or valuable. In his book, Last Child in the Woods, Richard Louv, who was the recipient of the 2008 Audubon Medal, pointed out that this is the first generation to grow up in a denatured environment. They had, of course, children today have no concrete experience of playing outside, planting a garden, caring for animals. Louv first became aware of this shift actually in the 1980s when he interviewed 3,000 children and parents from around the country and asked them about their relationship with the natural world. And to his surprise, most children did not find being out in nature enjoyable. They thought of exploring in nature as being unproductive, off limits, dangerous. One fourth grader told him that he liked to play inside better because that's where the electrical outlets were. Well, of course, we no longer need the electrical outlets to be connected. In 2010, they did a study at the University of Maryland where they asked 200 students to give up media for 24 hours and to write about their experience. Actually, 75% of them gave up because they couldn't stand being without their technology for 24 hours. But the same attitude towards the outside showed up in that too. I mean, students would say things like, well, I always text or listen to my iPhone when I go to walk to class, so walking to class was very boring. One person said, I had to stare at everybody as I walked because there was nothing else to do. And the thing about it too is now that today the social spaces where young people used to get together have been replaced by virtual spaces that are accessed through the web. Turns out now, it used to be the case that teenagers said they did not like to talk on the telephone, they liked to text. Now they say they don't want to go out and meet face-to-face, they prefer to video chat. Jean Twenge interviewed a typical 13-year-old who talked about how she spent most of her vacation in her bedroom alone with her phone, texting and video chatting with her friends. And she said, my bed has like an imprint of my body on it. And so when Jean Twenge said to her, do you think that all communication is going to end up being like this? She said, yep, and then we'll never have to get off the couch. Another indication of the shift in the attitude towards nature is that in 2007, the Oxford Junior Dictionary came out with a new edition. And it turns out that they culled a lot of the words concerning nature. Some of the words that they took out, for example, were acorn, beech, buttercup, heron, ivy, kingfisher, pasture, willow, and those words were replaced by words like attachment, blog, broadband, chat room, cut and paste. When the editor was asked, why did you take out all the words relating to nature, she said, well, the dictionary needs to reflect modern-day childhood. Prior examples of the dictionary reflected semi-rural environments. She said, children used to see the seasons, but they don't anymore. The environment has changed. Now, one of the results of this continuous connection is that children have little, if any, direct relationship with nature, and they see the world through the mediation of screens. Much of our learning in schools now is computer-mediated learning. So while they may have, an abstract knowledge of, say, the Amazon rainforest, most children are unable to identify the tree in their backyard. We see this every year when we host school groups. We host about 5,000 children in school groups to our farm, and most of the children who live in an urban environment have no idea where eggs and milk come from except from the grocery store. So as many people have pointed out, this disconnection from immediate experience robs us of an invaluable source of knowledge. My husband grew up in England on his grandfather's 10-acre homestead, and that 10-acre homestead was completely self-sufficient. His grandfather was able to provide all the needs for his family, and he remembers how his grandfather would go outside, look at what the birds and squirrels were doing, and would come in and say to his grandmother, "Don't wash tomorrow, Mother, it's going to rain." Plus, he would collect pieces of wool that had been snagged, the sheep had snagged on barbed wire fences, check how oily it was, and depending upon how oily it was, he would be able to predict what kind of a winter it was going to be. He would also go out, look at his fruit trees, and hammer a rusty nail into the trunk at a certain point to divert the sap so that the trees would bear more fruit. He was not what we would call an educated man, but with that knowledge that he had of the environment, he was able to provide for all his family's needs. The author Bill McGibbon has said, "We believe we live in an age of information, that there is an information explosion. In a certain narrow sense, this is true, but in many important ways, just the opposite is true. We live at a moment of deep ignorance when vital knowledge humans have always possessed about who we are and where we live seems beyond our reach. An unenlightenment, an age of missing information." At the same time, as young people are disconnected from reality, they have the illusion that they are experiencing things that they observe. We experienced this one time when there was a visitor to our farm, and she was showing her daughter the horses. And she said, "See, when we go riding, remember we shoe the horse, we put the saddle on the horse, and then we go riding." And we were a little mystified as why she shod her horse every time she went riding, until we realized that going riding for her child was an experience that took place on the computer. So I had a young person tell me that I would really like this particular video game because he said you get to grow your own vegetables. So I discovered that the game he was playing was Farmville. Anyone know about Farmville? And that there were actually 8 million people a day at that time playing Farmville. And we had a lady in a knitting class one day and her phone beeped and she said, "Oh, I have to plant my carrots." And she proceeded to plant her carrots on the computer. Now the thing is that most people growing vegetables on the computer have no desire for the real life experience. The real life experience is not considered stimulating or valuable, but is considered to be hard work. And I was reminded of this when I recently read a review of University of Notre Dame professor Patrick Deneen's book. I think it's called The Failure of Liberalism or something, but he's talking about the failure of the political system, and he speaks approvingly of the formation of small communities, and he says we need to regain the ability to do things for oneself, provision one's own household through the work of one's own hands and one's children's hands. And the reviewer was very dismissive about this and said, many in the world have the misfortune of having to provide for themselves. This is a life they want to escape and that we should not want to recapture. So I venture to guess this man did not have a close relationship with nature and didn't grow his own garden. Another consequence of the disconnection from the natural world is that MIT professor Sherry Turkle has pointed out that children don't necessarily think of simulation as second best. She recounted taking her 7-year-old on a boat trip on the Mediterranean, and her little girl, who was very familiar with simulated fish tanks, pointed to a jellyfish and said, "Look, Mommy, a jellyfish, it looks so real." When Sherry Turkle repeated this to a vice president at Disney World's Animal Kingdom, he shared with her that visitors to Animal Kingdom complain that the real animals are not as interesting or realistic as the robotic animals that they see in other parts of Disney World. We actually knew somebody who lived in Dubai, which is a technology-saturated environment. When her child saw a real dog for the first time, she said, "Wow, how many batteries does that thing take?" So the thing is that children are losing the ability to distinguish between living and non-living things, or to decide which is the most preferable. Turkle talks about some children in a zoo looking at Galapagos turtles, and they decided that the robotic ones were much nicer because the real ones had dirty water and they were gross. So as these examples demonstrate, and I've just given a very few and gone over very quickly, the more obsessed with technology we become, the less likely we are to appreciate the wonders of God's real-life creation. And there will be little motivation to develop an attitude of responsibility and care for the natural environment. In addition, spending hours tethered to digital devices leaves little time or desire for any kind of sustained and direct interaction with the natural world, and actual participation in nature seems to be distasteful to many children. So it seems that developing a sustainable culture requires an alternative environment that reconnects us with the natural world in practical ways that deepen our relationship with God, His creation, and each other. You can't grow, as we say, the environment is very important. You can't grow bananas in Alaska. The philosopher William Barrett has said, "We cannot will back a faith that has been lost. We shall have to live back into that way of being in whose ambience the religious once drew breath." So the question, of course, is it really possible in this day and age to uproot ourselves from the prevailing culture and develop such an alternative, nurturing environment? And in answering that question in the affirmative, I want to share a real-life example of agrarian-based intentional Christian community. 20 years ago, in my 50s, I became a Christian, and I joined Homestead Heritage, which is a non-denominational, intentional Christian community that is agrarian-based, that is here in Waco. There are now more than 1,000 people in our community. They come from all over the world, from an infinite variety of ethnic, cultural, educational, economic, and professional backgrounds. But as a body of believers, each of whom has had a powerful experience with God, we are united in our commitment to live according to biblical values and the patterns that provide the overarching framework for our lives. So the community was founded 45 years ago by one couple in the most unlikely of places, New York City, in an area called Hell's Kitchen. As the community developed and a group of people started coming and becoming part of this mission church, God led them as a body of people, of about 100 people, close-knit people, on an exodus from the values of the urban industrial environment to embrace a simple agrarian lifestyle and to deepen the community's roots in the Anabaptist tradition. So they moved as a group to Colorado, where they learned to farm with horses, grow crops, plant gardens, raise animals, and to relearn the traditional crafts such as woodworking, spinning, weaving, pottery, to provide the essentials of life for themselves. And, we have to understand, and it's amazing to me because I was not part of the community at this point, that this was a group of urban people who did not know how to do any of these things. It wasn't that they had grown up in a community, an agrarian community. And they learn, and in learning all these crafts, the most important thing really was that they learned what it means to live in close relationship with each other as the body of Christ, members of one body, each of whom has a need for the other. After several years, part of the community was in Texas, and desiring not to be isolated and to share our way of life with others, in 1990, we moved to Waco. So our main community is now in Waco, where we have a 550-acre working farm. We farm with horses. We raise staple crops such as wheat, corn, sweet potatoes, sorghum, and we raise some larger animals such as dairy, cattle, and sheep. We have a large craft village where we host about 300,000 people a year who come to our craft village, and to our school, which is called the Plowshare Institute of Sustainable Culture, where we have about 150 year-round classes where we teach the skills that we've learned over 45 years so that people will gain those skills. Our students go home and put into practice the skills that they've learned here. So what are some of the lessons that we've learned on our journey in embracing this life? Well, in thinking about the disconnection and the fragmentation and the alienation of techno-industrial culture, we see that the means to accomplish a shift to an alternative culture, we see a clue of that in the shared roots of the words cure and care. Cure and care share the same root. Healing refers to bringing a sense of wholeness out of disintegration and fragmentation. So when we think about care, we believe that we must start by bringing back within relational reach of direct human care those functions and tasks essential to human life, including the ways we borrow from nature to feed and clothe ourselves, and the way we care for each other. So such care involves more direct responsibility for relationship with nature and each other. On our farm, our primary goal is not to raise crops for financial profit. In exercising direct care for the land, we've consciously chosen subsistence production over market production. So most of the farm-raised produce is we use for our community's use. Any excess that we have, we sell in our grist mill where we grind our own corn, or in our cafe, or else given away to people who are not able to do this for themselves. Consequently, because we are not focused on raising crops for financial profit, we are not under the economic pressure that has caused the drastic loss of American farmers. We are not having to compete with industrial agriculture. Now there is less than 2% of the population are farmers, whereas in 1900, 40% of the population were farmers. And the average age of the farmer in the United States is over 57 now. Subsistence farmers, as many authors have pointed out, had the reputation of being good husbandmen who used the land differently from those who used the land to extract a cash crop. So when we're thinking about sustaining creation, in growing crops, raising animals on our farm, we use no petrochemical fertilizers, herbicides. We raise our animals in a humane fashion, and we give the land a Sabbath rest every 7 years. Occasionally, we'll have someone say, "Oh, I grew up on a farm, and I couldn't wait to get away." But as I always say to people, there is a difference between growing things for oneself and doing it for economic profit. For example, in our weaving shop, I spin cotton. And so when people come in and I'm showing them spinning cotton, I'll tell them, you pick the cotton, take the seeds out, comb it, and then spin it, and people will go, "Oh, picking cotton." But picking cotton for yourself from a few plants where you gather the cotton every time it blooms is not the same as thinking about picking cotton if you had to pick 5,000 acres of cotton or something. And also, we are in a context of a community where we have a community of people helping one another, because when you live an agrarian life, you need neighbors help one another. In addition to our community farm, most of our individual families have small homesteads where they have vegetable gardens, fruit trees, poultry. Some of them have a large animal like sheep or a cow. We have 2 chickens in our household of 3, so they provide the chickens for 3 people. So, of course, this growing your own food provides a nutritious food supply for the family. For people in our community, like myself, who can't have a big garden, other families give us the excess from their gardens. So, of course, we're also assured that our food is healthy, and we don't have to worry about the food safety issues that we have to worry about in the wider culture. I read just recently that the Centers for Disease Control estimates that each year 48 million people get sick from a foodborne illness, 128,000 are hospitalized, 3,000 die. So we don't have to think about those things. The average meal on the American table travels 1,500 miles from farm to table. So in addition, very importantly, raising gardens together is an activity that families can do together. Parents, grandparents, children, all can work together in the garden, and it's a nice family activity. With regard to nurturing relationships, the agrarian lifestyle helps us to develop close relationships with one another. Unlike the competitive ethos of the urban environment, an agrarian lifestyle is cooperative rather than competitive. We help our neighbors as together we gather crops, build a barn, or provide for other people. When we harvest our sweet potato crop, it's a 3-day event that many members in the community take part of. We do it together, so we enjoy it together. When we have our sweet potato harvest, you can see the youngest children running around showing the biggest potato they could find. One year we were gathering the wheat. The wheat was all in shocks, and we needed to get it in, and we got a phone. We found out that a rainstorm was coming. So a telephone call went out to everybody in the community, and hundreds of community members converged on the land, got the shocks of wheat in, and we got the last one in before it started to rain. In this context, the lives of all members of the community, young and old, are woven together. Whether it be on the farm, in our craft workshops where our children are learning the crafts. Actually, so are old people. I mean, I learned how to weave and spin after I retired, and a young person in the community taught me how to do those things. So it's not only young people who are in the craft workshops. But we design those workshops so that parents and children can work together when they're learning the crafts. When the children are learning the crafts, then they can go home and continue doing those crafts together. So we're together on the farm, in craft workshops, in times of worship, in fellowships. And so since we are all together, it's natural to take care of one another when there's a need. A special needs such as caring for the sick or assisting the elderly or fashioning a hand-sewn quilt for each couple who gets married in our community. And you know, as the scripture says, you will know them by their love for one another. I think of an elderly lady in our community who was dying of cancer, and she could not sleep at night. So young people in our community volunteered to go over and sing for her through the night. And the thing is that they talked about what an incredible experience it was for them and not just for her. And 10 years ago, I used to write a lot about living and dying with dignity in my professional work. 10 years ago, my husband got cancer, and 15 ladies in the community volunteered to help me provide him with round-the-clock care for the last 3 or 4 months of his life. And it was an incredible experience. We formed bonds of love that will never be broken. Reconnecting our children in terms of, so how do you reconnect your children to the natural world? With regard to education, we homeschool our children. We purposely combine academic and experiential learning. So we try to teach, we teach in a relational rather than an abstract perspective, so that our children immediately grasp that their academic skills have practical application. So they're using their math for figuring out how long a piece of thread you need to warp a loom, or how you lay out your garden. And so they are actually doing botany and biology as they care for the garden and animals, or they use their careful observation for writing a content for an essay or painting a picture. And I was reminded what Cal DeWitt said yesterday in his presentation, where he was talking about how in Scripture it always says, behold the lilies of the field, behold. And he was urging us to remember that when we interact with nature, we need to behold so that we really see. And I felt like that's one thing that we are doing in our education. Wendell Berry, I found this quote from him. He said, "We have the world to live in on the condition that we will take good care of it. And to take good care of it, we have to know it. And to know it and to be willing to take care of it, we have to love it. And we can't do that if we're disconnected from nature." So because of what our children are learning and their involvement with nature, many of our older children have joined with older members of the community in various sustainable research projects, such as designing, building, and operating an aquaponics greenhouse, or thinking about sustainable methods for purifying water, or the best methods to raise bees to counteract the rapid decline in the bee population. As part of our agrarian lifestyle, we also, and the focus on the crafts, one of the things that we realize is that this is just not a material thing we're doing, that it helps to develop important character traits in our children. We have a saying, it's not what the boy does to the wood, it's what the wood does to the boy. And you know, in learning traditional crafts, in our craft workshops, they're not just learning manual skills, they're learning things like patience, perseverance, the ability to pay attention versus the need for constant distraction, responsibility on an ongoing basis. You have to take care of your plants and animals or they will die. And I thought of the contrast between that and Farmville, where if your crops die, you can pay to buy an unwither machine and you spray your crops and they immediately come back to life. So also, of course, we found that caring for animals teaches our children to be empathic. And you know, this is at a time where if you look at the research on what technology is doing and the ways of interacting that we interact through technology, studies show that it has caused an alarming decrease in empathy among young people. Also, one of the things that research shows is that there is a positive impact of a restorative impact of direct involvement with nature. They have found that involving children with nature is effective in reversing a range of mental disorders, such as attention deficit disorder. This is at a time when 8 million children in the United States are diagnosed correctly or not with mental disorders. And also, direct involvement with nature can improve all children's cognitive abilities and resistance to negative stresses such as depression. You know, this again is at a time when suicide is the second leading cause of death among our young children, among our teenagers. Well, in placing man in the garden, God did so for a specific purpose. Having a close relationship to the land shows us concretely our ultimate dependence on God, and it also shows us that we have only limited dominion over the land. The times and the seasons are not ours to control. The natural rhythms of sowing, planting, harvest are determined by the Creator. Now, recognizing the natural seasons of life, spring, summer, fall, winter, also helps us to recognize the natural seasons of life in ourselves. And it also helps us to see that each season has its own intrinsic worth. It also, and this, I believe, counters the prevailing societal attitudes that we have about radical independence, control, that there are no givens in life, that the emphasis on youth as opposed to aging. Recognizing God's seasons helps us to see that every season has its own intrinsic worth. Also, living in close relation to the land, we daily experience the wonder of God's creation. We experience the miracle of life when we see the newly born foal, when we see the green shoots shooting up through the soil. When we give thanks for the food on our table, we realize what a gift it is that God has provided it for us. So the living experience of the natural world gives us a concrete awareness of the transcendent God, which engenders an attitude of awe, humility, and gratitude, which again impels an ethic of responsibility for taking care of his creation. You know, the Hebrew word avad not only means to work, it's also translated as to till the soil and to worship. And these meanings are not as disparate as they might seem when you are in an agrarian context. Cultivating his garden according to his eternal rhythms. In doing that, we worship, we express reverence, and we thank him daily. I remember as a child in England, living in a more rural environment, that we celebrated times of harvest and church festivals and in our hymns of praise. And I think of these hymns of praise now. We plough the fields and scatter the good seed on the land, but it is fed and watered by God's almighty hand. All good gifts around us are sent from heaven above. Then thank the Lord, oh thank the Lord for all his love. Come ye thankful people, come, raise the song of harvest home. All is safely gathered in ere the winter storms begin. God our Maker doth provide for our wants to be supplied. Come to God's own temple, come, raise the song of harvest home. So this context does indeed cultivate a way of being in whose ambience the religious can draw breath. But these words can have little or no meaning to a generation completely disconnected from the land and absorbed in virtual reality. In sum, then, since the connection to the land is not arbitrary in God's design, I think as Christians we must recognize the extent to which the prevailing culture disconnects us from nature, reality, and each other. And as Christians, if we are to fulfill the biblical mandate to care for creation, I believe that we do have to take active steps to disconnect ourselves from this hostile environment and reorient our lives in such a way as to reconnect our children with the natural world, with reality, and with each other. For many, this will require a radical shift in values from the culture of the mainstream and an extraordinary commitment to make an exodus into a community of like-minded people who are committed to the life-affirming task of restoring a sustainable culture in which our children and future generations can strive. I was struck by a couple of things that Ellen Davis said last night. She said that preserving man and animals means preserving the family farm, preserving knowledge. And she said communities can produce food within the limits of nature. And we do know that to be true. And I recognize that how difficult this is in a culture where we are so involved with technology, but it's not impossible. As the 45-year experience of our community, who came out of a very urban environment, shows, and as our newer satellite communities, we now have satellite communities in Idaho, Montana, Virginia, Monterey, Mexico, New Zealand, South Africa, and Israel. And in these newer communities, many of the people are young families with young children who want to participate in developing an alternative, sustainable culture. There is a song that we sing in our community, and believe me, you are very blessed that I am not going to attempt to sing it. But words of one of the verses is, there's joy in the journey, good times in the going. It's not all in the reaping, there's plenty in the sowing. Taking pleasure in the progress we make from day to day. Oh, there's joy in the journey to heaven all the way. And I can testify there is joy. That last music is a song that we sing that says, there can be miracles if you believe. when I watch the video, it always makes me cry. Because it's such a miracle that I'm part of it, and it's so wonderful. Well, it's all right, I'll pull myself together for for conversation.
We have time for questions if you would like to ask them, and we'd like to begin our conversation.
More comments? Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that there are a number of other communities that have started, and let's say you following this whole thing that seems like a good direction to go. One of the questions that comes up has to do with, in our modern time, very few people have access to land or the finances available to own land and to set up a community. And so I'm wondering, these various communities that you mentioned in different countries, how they went about that, dealing with that issue that sometimes really is a barrier.
Well, they did. They haven't all started out by getting a piece of land. They've started out by becoming a community of people with this shared vision who've started in small ways, like started having gardens and beginning to do the crafts. And in some of the places, like I'll talk about New Zealand, they have now been able to get a small piece of land, but they didn't at the beginning. But they joined together in terms of living in close proximity with one another, and then they actually opened a cafe and a bakery and started doing that kind of a thing. And then they've gradually expanded into doing more of the craft kind of work that brings in, the businesses. And then they managed to get a piece of land. So it's, when our community first moved to Colorado, they didn't immediately have a piece of land. They moved to the area, but they all lived close together, and that was the vision, and worked towards the point where they could do that. And actually before we moved to Waco, there were people in Austin, and the only piece of land that they had there was it about 5 acres? Yeah, they just had 5 acres of land where they had like a community garden. And so it didn't, as you can tell, it didn't start out like this. So it's been a journey. And in our community in Monterey, they live in Monterey, right in the, in the drug culture of Monterey, and they've got together as a community, they worship together, they're focusing on those things that we believe are important in terms of the way you live your life. And they're just now trying to get a piece of land. So it begins with small steps, Yes?
Do you know how many of the families in the homestay community kind of work on the farm, kind of within the craft village? And for those that don't, how do they kind of manage having kind of one?
Well, many of our members have their own businesses. And so there are people in our community who have like a plumbing business, construction business. We actually do have some people who have some connection working with computers, I believe. We also have a business where we take down historic barns. And we go all over the country. Actually, we've put up barns in other countries of the world, people work in those businesses. So almost everybody in the community, in fact, probably everybody, is connected to a business that is connected to somebody in the community. Now, I taught at Baylor for a couple of years before I retired, but I don't think there are a couple of people here for the community, so I can ask them. I don't think that there is anybody who's not working something connected to the community, do you?
I think most everybody is connected
Yeah.
to some form of business.
Yeah.
As far as the question, there's probably, maybe 50 or so that work on the land in fact. But we don't take census.
I've been saying that there are 1,000 members in our community for several years, but I think there are probably more because we don't really know.
I think one of the points, though, is that everybody is centered on the land, connected to the land. So you may have a business as a carpenter, but when the call goes out to harvest sweet potatoes, it's a place that everybody can gather together and work together. Their children, grow up there on the farm, have the opportunity to experience that, to be in connection with God's creation, to have things that many children don't have today.
Yeah. Yes.
I've been out to the Homes and Heritage a number of times. It's stunningly beautiful. It's so well organized. So one of the questions is, how do you shape community life just in terms of organizing yourselves? And who's going to plant sweet potatoes this year? Who's going to plant wheat? Who's going to open the cheese shop? Just those sort of practical questions of organizing yourself as a community. What are the principles that drive that and undergird that?
Well, with regard to the farm, we have somebody who is over the farm, so I suppose they make the decisions as to what is planted, and people who are working on the farm work for that person. So with regard to, you mean who's going to start a cheese shop?
Yeah, just some general principles or organizing principles for the community.
I'm the cheese shop.
Oh, okay.
We milk our own cows, and at one point there was more milk than we could use. And one of the older teenage girls went to her dad and said she wanted to learn how to make cheese, and he encouraged her to do that, and she started doing it, and she started making more than their family could use, and that's the beginning of the cheese business. So, which is now this cheese business in Idaho and here, and it's won first place awards all over, including, was it Brie for North America, which made the people in Quebec upset. Some Americans have won the Brie award, but that's where that is from.
And Sue is here. Sue, bless her heart, always comes to help me around, so we're very grateful for that. But she had I could get her to tell it, but she had a burden. People used to weave in their own houses, and Sue had a burden to forward the vision for weaving and spinning for our community. And really, out of her burden grew the Fiber Arts Barn. So those things, they kind of come up like that.
And now she only works 48 hours a day. Besides taking care of the family.
If I could illustrate something about that, before I farmed the last 30 years there, and almost 30 years. But I came out of a business background, setting up businesses and such, and so the question, it seems so organized. I mean, for those of us that came out of a very structured, very organized, that seems kind of humorous. Because lady that had a burden for cheese, Sue had a burden. They had a real understanding of what it means to respond, which is where we get the word responsibility. And there was something that we believe that God put in their hearts, and they responded to that. And God met them in their response, and they were able then to do what seems to many people to be impossible. And it was just taking responsibility one little step at a time, one little place at a time, and then it blossoms. So it's not as if there's this individual or individuals that has some kind of massive organization that's putting, it's each individual having that response before God and therefore becoming responsible.
You know, I like this story too. We have our cafe, and now it's very popular. We have lots and lots of people coming to eat at the cafe. And at one point, we asked somebody who knew a lot about catering and organizing restaurants and things to come and they offered to come and look at what we were doing and, give us some pointers. And after a while, he said to us, the way you've got everything set up in the kitchen is actually not the way that you should do it. But he said,
That's actually a lot nicer than
yeah.
he described it.
Yeah, he said it's completely wrong, didn't he, or something? But he said the amazing thing is you've got all these people who work together and who take initiative. If they see something that needs to be done, they do it. They don't just say it's their job. And he said it's amazing. And so that really is, we have a fair at Thanksgiving. If you're here, please come. It's all day Friday, all day Saturday. And last year we had over 20,000 people came to the fair, and we do all the catering, and we have all these seminars going. And I think it was somebody from NASA came and said, how do you organize this thing? Well, it's not like there's one person who says, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. People take responsibility, say, I have a burden for this area, and I've got a burden for doing this, and so that's how it works.
Speaking as a minister, I've got awareness that the modern church has an issue with young adults walking away from church, going off to college and maybe not finding their way back to church. What happens when a typical family at Homestead, when the child grows up and is about 18, 20 years old, do they come back?
Well, we of course believe in believers' baptism. And so our young people, there is no expectation that just because a young people grew up in this community, they're going to spend their life here. It's their decision, it's their commitment. So we do have some young people who decide that this is not, they think they'd like to go somewhere else and do something else. When you look at the research and you see how many young people leave traditional, well, I'll say traditional church, mainstream, I keep doing that, mainstream churches, fewer young people leave our community. Some who do leave after they've been somewhere else decide that they want to make their way back. And we have young people who now have come back to us. So, but when you live in community, it really is a commitment. I suppose I could think about it like being married. It's not like, you go to a church on Sunday and you decide, well, I didn't like it, I'm going to go to another church. Once you really feel that this is the place you want to be, it's it's not something where you just shift every time.
I mean, the overwhelming majority of the kids stay.
Yes.
And they just feel a meaning in their lives, and a lot of the ones who've left and come back have talked about how they just couldn't find that anywhere else
Yeah.
for themselves. So many have come back. And that's what we stress, that it's got to be their conviction.
Yeah.
We don't want anybody there, including our own kids who, of course, want to stay, to be there. It's really their conviction, the vision they see, why they're doing what they're doing, and the purpose of it, in God.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, so in one of her answers last night, Davis said sort of a very realistic phrase, like, as I look to the future, I see suffering on a wide scale, in response to the question about sustainable ag and food production and population growth. So that's been ringing around in my head, as I'm sure is the case for a lot of other people. And I think, so first of all, thank you for the work that your community does. It's so easy to criticize from every side attempts like yours. So that's in the background, but I just wonder what your response was as somebody who's doing the daily work in a small way, trying to be rooted in a piece of land when you heard that sort of. Yeah, so I guess my question is just how do you maintain realistic hope, and how do you maintain the tension of what you're doing in your locale and the reality of sort of local disaster that we're in?
Right. Well, when she said that last night, what occurred to me was the sociologist Axelrod, I think it's Robert Axelrod, right? He said this, and it applies, I think, that if one individual who wants to work on with a cooperative ethic tries to do it in a culture where competition is the ethic, that person is bound to fail, right? If you're the only person who's working on that kind of an ethic. But he said the research shows that if you have a cluster of people who are cooperators, together they can function in a community that is overwhelmingly competitive. And not only can they function as a cluster, but that people in the community who are operating on a competitive ethic will begin to see that the cooperative ethic is working and will change, but then you can have clusters all over the place. And that's what we feel like. We feel like we don't just want this community here in Waco to work. We want this way of living, this way of cooperating, this way of caring for one another, because we believe that this is what Jesus told us to spread to other areas. And so there'll be groups all over the world who are cooperating with one another. We're cooperating with our community in South Africa and New Zealand and so forth. So I don't think that as individuals we can change we can't change what's happening in terms of the desecration of the land, just one of us, but that as clusters of people who are doing something different, we can show that there's an alternative. Because when I first went up to Homestead, I just went to see the pottery shop. I saw there was a pottery shop at this place called Homestead Heritage, and so I didn't know what it was. I went up there, and it was the first time that I had seen, wow, there's an alternative way to live. I mean, I didn't know there was an alternative. And to be perfectly honest with you, at the time that I went up to Homestead, I was very cynical about Christianity. Because I was very self-righteous, you have to understand. And I had kind of given up. And when I drove up the lane and I saw there was a scripture over the gate, I said to my husband, oh no, this is a Christian community and they're going to come out and preach, so we'll just stay for 30 minutes. But I walked in, and I walked into the gift shop, and I looked around. I said, this is a different world. And so, I got to know people. But I knew I was smart enough to know, because I've lived all over the world, that this couldn't just be a bunch of nice people who happened to get together, but that there had to be something transcendent holding it together, to which they were all committed over and above their own personal selfishness. And so that caused me to say, what is this? And so, that's how I think. We want to be a city on a hill, and we want other people to see that there is a hope, that there is, that we don't have to throw up our hands and say there's no hope, and there is suffering. And of course, we believe that this is a fallen world and there is suffering. But, I'll tell you, I can tell you that when my husband was diagnosed with cancer, I wrote in my journal, we are in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I thought of the scripture that said that when Jesus was agonizing in the garden, the disciples were asleep, and that one of the gospel narratives said they were asleep because they were overcome with sorrow. And I said to a friend in the community, the thing that I am most afraid about is that I will not be able to stand with my husband in his suffering. And this person said to me, we will stand with you. And you can go, though suffering is always personal, you can go through anything if you have people who will go through it with you. So when I think about her saying that there is suffering, there is. But if you have a group of people who will go through it with you, it really does help you to go through whatever you have to go through.
Can I say one thing?
Yes.
I think the context of that was somebody's asking about the practical thing of feeding in the world and everything. And your already answers to that also butcher and she said at one point that small scale organic, self-sufficient really is the most productive way to use the land. So that, we're not saying the world is going to do it, but they really are that. This really is a practical way to meet even that mass problem.
Yes.
Can I ask about how does your community do health care or health insurance to kind of take care of your health needs as well as retirement?
We have a healthcare sharing scheme, so that, well, first of all, we have a physician who is part of our community, and he takes care of those of them on the community. If we need to see somebody outside of the community, we have a healthcare sharing scheme that will help. It's like, I'm going to say it's like a Christian insurance company. You understand what I mean? So, but when it comes down to the actual practical, how do we care for people. We have people in our community who come from backgrounds of nursing and that kind of thing. And we meet the need as a community and in our groups. So, which is what happened with my husband, you know.
Is it owned by the whole community or one or two families? Or
No, the land is owned by the community, but we don't hold our property in common. We all have our own houses and our own piece of land. But you know, there are some people in the community who are financially better off than other people. So if there is a need, then we all help with the need. We have had several widows in our community, and we homeschool our children. So the community provided income to the widows all through, you know, so that's how we do it.
And then
Would you join me in thanking Dr. Toombs?